I'm going to take a look at Fire Pro Wrestling S 6-Man Scramble for the Sega Saturn. This game was released in 1996, and it was the successor to Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium for the Super Nintendo. As would be expected, the game featured advanced graphics, new modes, characters, moves. Essentially, it's an update to the already great game. Now, these are the WWF and WCW characters in the game. Obviously, their outfits look different, but their original costumes are in here. As you can see, I have several of them selected here with the original costumes. So kind of the gimmick of this game is all the Fire Pro Wrestlings before this only had 4 characters out at once. This game has 6 characters out at once. The successor to this game is Fire Pro Wrestling G for the Sony PlayStation, and that game as well only has 4 characters out at once. It wasn't until Fire Pro Wrestling D for the Sega Dreamcast that we saw 8 characters out at once. Fire Pro Wrestling S is actually a milestone in the series. It was the first one to have the cage match, and it was also the first one to have the gruesome match. The cage match in this game is just badass. It's covered in barbed wire, it's electric, and it has C4 explosives on it. This is one of the few games to ever make the cage match enjoyable. The gruesome match replicates Ultimate Fighting Championship. So you fight in the octagon, and you can only defeat your opponent by knocking him out or submission. As it stands now, this game is still the basis of the Fire Pro Wrestling games after it. In 1999, we saw the release of Fire Pro Wrestling G for the Sony PlayStation. For the most part, Fire Pro Wrestling G is pretty much the same game. The character sprites look exactly the same, but the roster in the game has been greatly updated. The biggest change you're going to find in the PlayStation release is that the backgrounds are now 3D. So it's not the biggest update considering there's a 3-year gap between the two, but I think the best part is that PlayStation owners were now able to get a Fire Pro Wrestling game. So if I had to choose between Fire Pro G and Fire Pro S, I'm going to definitely go with Fire Pro G. It addressed a few problems we had in Fire Pro S, it has a much better roster, and frankly the presentation of the game is better as well. But that doesn't mean this game isn't great by any means. This game is now 11 years old and it's still one of the best wrestling games you can get. And for you Fire Pro enthusiasts, there was actually another Fire Pro game released on the Sega Saturn in 1995. It was called Fire Pro Wrestling Gaiden Blazing Tornado, but it was also released on the arcade and simply called Blazing Tornado. For some reason, the Sega Saturn version is slightly different than the arcade version. Blazing Tornado is a somewhat simplified version of these Fire Pro Wrestling games. The presentation of the game is also inspired by the arcade games of that era. It's an interesting release that hardcore Fire Pro Wrestling fans might want to take a look at. Anyhow, it's a solid wrestling arcade game, and I plan to review it sometime down the road. So Fire Pro Wrestling S 6-Man Scramble is getting pretty hard to find nowadays. The cheapest I could find it is online for $40 and $50 off of eBay. And that's the price for a used game. So if you have the opportunity to download the game or buy it really cheap, I'd say jump right on top of it. Now there are definitely some better versions of Fire Pro Wrestling out there, but Fire Pro Wrestling S is a great release and it's a classic game. So my final thoughts are, Fire Pro Wrestling S is definitely not as advanced as Fire Pro Wrestling D or Fire Pro Wrestling Returns. But nevertheless, this is still a kick-ass game. I played it for hours upon hours, and I love it. So as I said, unless you can find this game for a really great price, I don't really recommend you buy it. I would much rather invest money in a newer version of this game. This game is a pure classic. I give it an A. If you're a wrestling fan and you get your hands on this game, I find it hard to believe you won't love it.